European generals crossed an ocean to watch America tear itself apart, and many left puzzled. They arrived expecting a clear demonstration of industrialized warfare, only to find a conflict that contradicted assumptions about technology, tactics, and the human organization of armies. Over the next 20 minutes, we'll walk through 5 surprising lessons those observers reported, why each upended contemporary thinking, and how their conclusions, when embraced or ignored, shaped the map of military ideas in the decades that followed. Lesson 1. Industrial capacity and logistics win wars. Observers in the North watched, often with reluctant admiration, as the Union turned factories, railways, and workshop floors into weapons. What shocked many European visitors was not a single brilliant maneuver, but the steady, grinding apparatus behind it. Standardized weapons pouring from northern foundries, rail networks moving tens of thousands of men and supplies across hundreds of miles, depots, ordnance trains, and systems for replacing worn-out equipment. Colonel Henry Fletcher and others emphasized that the Union's advantage lay less in superior generalship on any given day and more in its ability to sustain a prolonged, large-scale military effort. For 19th-century European staffs accustomed to wars decided by decisive battles and short campaigns, this was counterintuitive. The assumption in Europe, reinforced by continental wars of limited scope, was that a campaign's outcome hinged on maneuver, morale, and the genius of commanders. The American example suggested something different, that industrial production, coordinated transport, and a reliable supply chain could determine who remained in the fight long enough to win. Railroads were not merely conveniences, they were strategic arteries. Armories and mass production meant weapons were interchangeable and losses could be replaced. Consistent munitions output reduced the risk that an army would run out of what mattered most. This lesson surprised because it shifted credit away from the battlefield's romantic center, the general on horseback, towards an often invisible logistical backbone. Observers noted practical innovations, consolidated ordnance depots, the Union's quartermaster organization, and the sheer scale of northern mobilization. These were not ephemeral tricks, but institutional adaptations to industrial society. They suggested that modern war would be fought as much in factories and yards as on open fields. Why does this matter beyond the Civil War? Because it reframed the question of preparedness. European officers returned home recognizing the importance of supply, raw materials, and industrial mobilization, but many treated those observations as interesting notes rather than as blueprints requiring systemic change. The lesson was clearly visible in reports and memoirs. Its full institutional adoption, however, was uneven.
Had European states uniformly reorganized their war economies earlier, the nature of later 20th century conflicts might have looked different. Yet even in the absence of wholesale adoption, the Civil War demonstrated that logistics could be decisive, a theme that would recur again and again in modern conflicts. If you enjoy informed history videos like this, subscribe for more. Lesson 2. Naval innovation and blockade operations reshaped sea power. The arrival of ironclads, especially the clash between the USS Monitor and the Confederate ironclad CSS Virginia, did more than make headlines. It forced navies to rethink the nature of armor, propulsion, and coastal warfare. John Ericsson's Monitor introduced a low-profile armored turret ship that could challenge traditional wooden hulls. European observers saw in that encounter the limits of wooden sail and the promise of steam-powered armored vessels capable of shrugging off conventional cannon fire. But the Civil War's maritime lessons extended beyond a single duel. Blockade operations along thousands of miles of coastline demonstrated how sea control, logistics, and industry interacted. The Union blockade, imperfect but persistent, constrained Confederate access to arms and supplies, creating a maritime squeeze that magnified the North's industrial advantages on land. European navies, watching these developments, took note. Russia and Britain expressed particular interest in monitoring developments in armored ships and coastal defense, and some commissioned study missions or experimental vessels in response. What made this lesson surprising was its combination of technological novelty and operational scale. Ironclads were not mere curiosities. They forced a rethink of ship design, armor distribution, and the role of steam in strategic mobility. Blockading, once a tactic among many, became a strategic instrument for economic strangulation when backed by industrial logistics and sustained naval presence. Observers understood that coastal fortifications and armored vessels would alter how states project power at sea, especially in narrow waters and along shallow coasts. That said, European reactions were complex and varied. Some navies moved quickly to experiment with armored vessels. Others, satisfied with their colonial-era fleets and doctrines, adopted changes slowly. The Civil War's naval chapter thus offered a clear demonstration of innovation's military consequences, even as the uptake of those lessons depended on budgetary, geographic, and strategic priorities back home. Lesson 3. Terrain and scale are doctrine killers. A recurring refrain among European officers who observed American campaigns was that the continent's familiar tactics, tight formations, rapid decisive maneuvers, and the expectation of a single climactic engagement were often impractical in the United States.
The American theater was vast, dotted with forests, rivers, and broken ground. Fronts were long and dispersed.
In those conditions, linear tactics and expectations of quick, decisive battles produced heavy casualties without decisive results. Field fortifications, skirmisher deployments, and protracted sieges became the norm in ways that many Europeans had not anticipated. Prussian Captain Justus Scheibert, whose reports were studied by German staff officers, emphasized the American tendency toward dispersed fighting and use of natural cover. He and others noted that engagements rarely replicated the compact battlefields of Central Europe. Instead, they involved fighting over ridges, through ravines, and along complex river networks. This forced both armies to improvise. The Union and Confederacy made extensive use of fieldworks, earthworks, and entrenchments, and adopted lighter, more flexible tactical formations suited to broken terrain. What made this lesson surprising was how quickly doctrine could be invalidated by geography and scale. European officers were trained on assumptions about communication lines, short interior lines, and close operational proximity between armies. The American experience showed that those assumptions did not travel well across continents. Fortifications and their tactical cousins, rifle pits, abatis, improvised breastworks, began to shape the operational tempo, making frontal assaults costly and often futile. This observation had direct implications for artillery and small arms. Breech-loading rifles and rifled artillery increased the effective range and lethality of fire, making massed columns more vulnerable in broken ground. European armies could have seen, in those developments, the beginning of a shift toward entrenchment and longer-range fire control. Some did, but others interpreted the same facts through their own recent victories and doctrines. The Civil War thus served as a warning. Tactics are not universal prescriptions. They are contingent on terrain, technology, and scale. Observers who grasped that contingency saw the limits of assumed doctrine. Those who didn't risked misapplying lessons to the wrong contexts. Lesson 4. Democratic volunteer armies can be unexpectedly adaptable. One of the more provocative conclusions drawn by observers like Henry Fletcher was that the American volunteer army, forged in a democratic society and animated by broad civic participation, displayed a surprising capacity for rapid learning and tactical innovation. Unlike the professional, aristocratically officered European armies, American volunteer formations often promoted initiative at lower ranks, adapted tactics in the field, and improvised to meet practical problems. This was not a claim that volunteer soldiers were inherently superior.
Rather, observers noted structural differences. Mass mobilization forced armies to devise scalable training systems. Widespread literacy in civic institutions meant a larger pool of capable junior leaders, and the sheer necessity of dealing with manpower turnover encouraged decentralized decision-making. Fletcher and others argued that this environment produced flexibility, units that could experiment with skirmish lines, sharpshooting, and combined arms improvisation in ways that professional armies, bound by strict tradition and class hierarchies, sometimes found difficult. The surprise lay in where initiatives seemed to originate. European militaries traditionally expected innovation to come from above, from staff colleges, elite regiments, or celebrated commanders. In America, many tactical innovations emerged from below, from junior officers and non-commissioned officers responding to immediate conditions. This bottom-up adaptation challenged European assumptions about command and control and raised uncomfortable questions about the rigidity of class-bound officer corps. The implications were practical. If a nation anticipated total war on a continental scale, it needed structures capable of educating, promoting, and empowering a wider pool of leaders. That suggested changes in recruitment, training, and promotion policies, reforms that some observers recommended. Yet institutional inertia and social hierarchies in Europe slowed the adoption of such ideas. The Civil War's lesson was not that democracy always made a superior soldier, but that systems which encouraged local initiative and mass political engagement could, under pressure, generate operational adaptability. Lesson 5. Institutional inertia meant Europe often ignored the warnings, and that shaped later strategic blind spots. Despite detailed reports, portraits, and study missions, many European militaries returned home interpreting the American conflict through the lens of their own recent experiences. The quick and relatively decisive wars that some continental powers had fought in the 1860s reinforced confidence in existing doctrines. The Franco-Prussian War, for example, seemed to validate Prussian methods and offered its own lessons that overlaid and sometimes obscured what Scheibert and others had reported from America. The surprising and sobering conclusion here is that observation alone was not sufficient. Political priorities, national myths, fiscal constraints, and pride all filtered how lessons were received. Some reforms were adopted, experiments with armored ships, incremental logistics adjustments, and doctrinal debates about conscription and officer education. But many deeper lessons about industrial mobilization, entrenchment, and the social basis of mass armies were only partially absorbed. Historians now argue that this partial uptake created blind spots. European planners saw certain aspects of modern war, but missed the full picture.
We must be careful in how we state the consequences. The Civil War did not cause later European wars in any direct, mechanical sense. Rather, it foreshadowed trends: industrialized production supporting prolonged conflict, the lethal combination of modern small arms and artillery with defensive works, and the challenges of mobilizing vast manpower that, when not fully appreciated, complicated military judgment in later decades. Some commentators in the early 20th century reinterpreted Civil War evidence to support their own theories. Others dismissed it as an American anomaly. The net effect was a patchwork reception, a wealth of information, selectively used. Why was this selective reception surprising? Because the observers were not naive. They were experienced men of arms who reported clearly and often presciently. The obstruction was institutional. Military cultures prefer patterns that confirm their past successes. Admitting that an army's effectiveness might depend as much on steel mills and rail stations as on drill halls required uncomfortable political and financial commitments. Where those commitments were made, reforms followed. Where they were not, European armies retained habits that would be tested in the decades to come. Across these 5 lessons, there is a common thread. The American Civil War served as a laboratory of modern war. Observers saw industrial logistics, naval innovation, the impact of terrain and scale, the adaptive potential of volunteer armies, and the consequences of institutional inertia. Each lesson was surprising because it challenged comfortable assumptions about heroism, about the locus of military genius, about the transferability of doctrine. Taken together, they presented a composite picture of warfare that was emerging in the 19th century, more technological, more industrial, and more contingent upon social organization than earlier conflicts. We should also acknowledge how bias colored interpretation. Some observers, like Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremont, arrived with romantic notions about Southern leadership and chivalric battle. Others, steeped in the Prussian school, highlighted tactical innovations useful to their own doctrines. Personal sympathies and national agendas shaped which facts were emphasized and which were downplayed. That reality helps explain why so many contradictory lessons circulated among European staffs. The same war could be read in multiple, politically useful ways. Another nuance worth stressing is scale. The United States was geographically vast and economically integrated in ways few European states were at the time. That made some Civil War lessons hard to transplant wholesale. Rail networks mattered in America partly because of long interior lines and a big industrial hinterland. In a smaller European theater, different mixes of mobility, infrastructure, and politics shaped choices. Observers who understood that contingency tended to offer more measured recommendations. Those who sought quick analogies often misapplied American lessons. How then did the Civil War change history? Not by acting as a single decisive pivot, but by seeding ideas that would grow unevenly across continents. It highlighted that industrial power could be weaponized, that iron and steam would alter naval warfare, that ground tactics depended on terrain and technology, that large-scale citizen armies could innovate from below, and that institutional resistance could blunt the impact of even the clearest evidence. In some cases, those lessons accelerated reforms. In others, they were sidelined, creating strategic blind spots later analysts would lament. So where does that leave us? The claim embedded in the title, that the American Civil War changed history, should be read as a claim about influence and missed opportunity, rather than as a simple cause and effect chain. The war offered clear observations and practical demonstrations of how modern war might work. Europe's mixed reception of those lessons shaped military thought in complicated ways, contributing to both reform and complacency. As we reflect on these 5 lessons, one final question lingers. What contemporary lessons are we watching unfold and failing to internalize? History's role is not just to catalog past errors, but to warn us of the habits and blind spots that endure. If the Civil War taught anything durably useful, it was this:
The future of conflict will be as much about factories, logistics, and social organization as it is about tactics on a single battlefield. Recognizing that fact early can be decisive. Ignoring it can leave institutions perilously unprepared. Like, comment, and check out our playlist on the American Civil War. Consider joining our members for exclusive deep dives.